delighted to welcome you to the first event of the fall and the very first event of our brand new humanities lecture series. We have, for those of you who haven't seen what we have to offer online or in the Takoma Park newsletter, we have these We Are Takoma pamphlets outside, and be sure to pick one up. In the lecture series, besides today's lecture, we're having one called Brewing Up History in Washington, D.C., one called BDSM, Sex, Hobby, Religion, or Art, and one called Breaking Around the Block, Hip-Hop Culture in East Germany During the Cold War. In addition to that, the Arts and Humanities Commission is going to be having, as it always has, as it has for the last few years, films, poetry, exhibits, dance, music. We have a pretty wonderful selection of things for you this, I want to call it a semester, but I think it's not a semester in this context. I urge you to pick up a copy of the leaflet so you can see what's coming up. Tonight, we have Professor Julie Anne Taddeo, who is a professor of British history at the University of Maryland. Her expertise is in the Victorians, the Edwardians, and popular culture. She's written about costume dramas, and she is a resident of Takoma Park, has been a resident for 9 years. And she will speak to us tonight on Downton Abbey and history, using the costume drama to explore the social world of the Edwardians. And my final reminder to you is to turn your cell phones off. Professor Taddeo.
Good evening, and thank you for spending your Thursday evening with me. I just started a new semester, and I always ask my students, why are you taking this class? Well, what's your interest in British history? And for the first time in the 10 years I've been at Maryland, a student actually asked me, what drew you to British history? And I thought for a second, do I give the stuffy answer that my colleagues would expect of me, or do I just tell the truth? And so I told the truth. I was honest and said, I grew up, and every Sunday night I spent with my mother watching Masterpiece Theater. And it was programs like Upstairs, Downstairs, the original Poldark, whatever the latest Dickens adaptation was, or the Forsyte Saga. I just fell in love with those types of stories. And that then led me to British novels, and ultimately my love of history and my desire to follow it as a profession. So I'm always excited, too, when my students say, oh, I've been watching Downton Abbey, or whatever the latest costume drama is on TV, because they want to know more about the history, too, behind all of these stories that we see on the small screen. So not since 1981's Brideshead Revisited has a period drama come even close to dominating the television ratings and shaping popular culture in the way that Downton Abbey has done over the last few years. Written by Julie Anne Fellows, Downton Abbey just completed its highly successful 5th season run in the UK and the US with record-breaking viewing figures, and it has fans ranging from P. Diddy and Jimmy Fallon to Michelle Obama. It's one of the most widely watched television dramas in the world, broadcast in more than 100 countries. It's such a popular import into China, with reportedly 160 million citizens watching the series, so that when the Chinese premier visited the UK recently, Prime Minister Cameron gifted him a script of Downton's first ever episode, autographed by Fellows himself. Downton has become a cultural phenomenon and an industry, and its money-spinning abilities are not limited to Highclere Castle, the Yorkshire stately home in which it is filmed and which now receives more than 60,000 visitors a year. The series has generated several best-selling official book companions, like this Life Below Stairs, numerous historical explorations of life in the Edwardian era, dolls, games, and other merchandise, and even cosmetics and teas. So you can play the board game and drink Lady Cora's evening tea. The British chain store Marks & Spencer's has a Downton Abbey makeup, bath, and body range, which is just the latest example of the show's clever marketing strategy. But popular support is not always matched by critical acclaim. Downton is often under attack for its socially conservative message. It portrays an aristocratic household in which servants and their employers live in a mutually respectful, contented, even affectionate existence. So for many, this is a problematic and idealized representation of social history. Nevertheless, we can learn quite a lot from Downton about the customs and values of the first 2 decades of the 20th century, as well as learn about ourselves, the viewers who look back to the past with our 21st century eyes, often with great longing. Originally, Downton rose to popularity in Britain alongside the newly elected conservative-dominated coalition government in Britain. It offered a mix of soap opera detail and escapist fantasy to an audience in the grip of worldwide recession. Since it first aired in 2010, Downton has become less rosy in its later seasons, reflecting perhaps the larger disillusionment which accompanies continued economic hardship on austerity in Britain. The death of key characters, Sybil and Matthew in season 3, the rape of Anna in season 4, for example, have given a grittier feel to the previously saccharine Downton world. But while these storylines may make the series more realistic, which should please historians, they're not always so appealing to fans. Academics have long thumbed their noses at TV period dramas, in much the way that they often deride the romance novels. These are 2 genres that are directed at and largely enjoyed by women. For that, they're often criticized. Historians accuse programs like Downton of editing out too much of history's darkness. The servants in this program are largely happy and healthy in a way that their real-life counterparts in the early 20th century would not have been. The First World War and the Spanish flu claimed the lives of only 2 minor characters, whereas in reality, 30 million people died worldwide from the war and the flu combined. And Mr. Bates's wrongful conviction and imprisonment for the murder of his wife is finally overturned, and he's happily restored to his wife and employment. So we see how legal, medical, and political systems largely seem to be successful, even if they usually require a member of the Crawley family, most often Lord Grantham himself, to intervene. For example, it was his appeal to the Home Secretary why Bates's death sentence was revoked. But it's also what makes this series so seductive. Its feel-good sense of an ordered and secure world where your loyalty to your employer is rewarded by his care and concern for you, and he uses his power for your benefit. We know that never happens nowadays. So it's true that Downton Abbey, like most period dramas, often view history and class relations through rose-colored glasses and make viewers nostalgic for a past that looks so beautiful on our TV screens. Elegant clothes, gorgeous interior decorations, fox-hunting ladies on horseback. But I don't think critics or historians are always fair in their attacks on these programs. After all, we the viewers are not mindless drones. We don't necessarily watch them for a history lesson or take them for literal truth. And even still, programs like Downton or Upstairs, Downstairs before it in the 1970s get a lot right about the time period that is represented. They show us how people would have behaved in certain situations, how the lives of men and women were dominated by the class into which they were born, how women and other minorities, such as homosexuals like Thomas, would have been marginalized and forced to hide the truth about their sexuality. These programs remind us that until very recently, women did not have access to the vote or contraception, let alone higher education or the professions. And as we now commemorate the 100-year anniversary of a war which claimed over 10 million lives across Europe, Downton shows how every aspect of society, from gender roles to medicine, from fashion to military tactics, were impacted by the war. In short, Downton presents a microcosm of British society in the early 20th century as it undergoes catastrophic changes, yet struggles to cling to many of its traditions. So tonight, I just want to talk about some of the events and characters who we encounter in Downton and what meaning we, as fellow students of history and fans of popular culture, can glean from them. When we first meet the fictional aristocratic Crawley family and their staff, who cohabit the 5,000-acre and centuries-old estate of Downton Abbey, a now very familiar catastrophe has just affected the household. We see Cora, Lady Grantham, reading the newspaper account of the Titanic, a British passenger liner that sank in the North Atlantic Ocean on the 15th of April, 1912, after colliding with an iceberg during her maiden voyage from Southampton, UK to New York City. The sinking of the Titanic caused the deaths of more than 1,500 people, and its sinking has since come to be read as the passing of the opulence of the Edwardian era. In the TV series, we learn that one of the passengers who perished was the heir to the estate. We've never met him, but his life and death tell us something very important about the world of the aristocracy, with its anachronistic traditions of property ownership favoring sons over daughters. Downton's estate is entailed, meaning it can only be passed on to male heirs, even though it was previously saved from ruin by the fortune of Cora, Lord Grantham's wealthy American wife. The eldest daughter, Mary, was expected to marry her cousin, who stood to inherit the abbey. She says, "So I'm just to marry my cousin and get out of the way?" But the idea was that she was supposed to do that, to keep the fortune and estate in the family. Killing off this cousin on the Titanic, therefore, leaves the fate of the abbey and Mary's future in doubt, and the discovery that the next in line, a distant cousin, Matthew Crawley, is an attorney, means that the aristocratic and middle-class worlds will now have to find a way to coexist. Matthew has always worked for his living, while Lord Grantham has lived off of the rents paid by his tenants on his massive estate. Neither understands each other's world. Plus, there is no guarantee that Matthew will fall in love with Mary, or vice versa. Should he marry someone else, the Crawleys will have to vacate what has for generations been their home and livelihood. Matthew's arrival at Downton signals a reality that Lord Grantham has refused to acknowledge, that it is in fact the middle class who dominate Britain's economic and social system. Even before this series setting of the Edwardian era, actually since the early 19th century and the Industrial Revolution, the growing middle class had amassed huge fortunes, and with their new money, married into and bought up many of the estates of the gentry and aristocracy, whose sons had managed to gamble away their fortunes. Lord Grantham's wife is an American heiress, whose money comes from business. And by the late 19th century, many British aristocrats looked across the ocean for their wives. Edith Wharton's final novel, The Buccaneers, for example, deals with this trend of nouveau riche Americans who love titles and the Brits who need their money to run their estates. Unfortunately, Lady Grantham has failed to produce a male heir, and Lord Grantham doesn't have much of a head for business. He makes bad investments and always needs bailing out. So it's Matthew, and later Lord Grantham's working-class son-in-law, the former chauffeur Branson, who try to modernize the estate and its farming techniques, always butting heads with their old-fashioned father-in-law. The sinking of the Titanic is therefore a very apt moment at which to begin the series. It represents the beginning of the end of this old order of aristocratic privilege and social hierarchy in which everyone knows their place. Rich and poor alike died on that cruise ship, and soon an even bigger catastrophe will rock the world of the Edwardians, and Downton in particular. Downton Abbey's first season gives us a glimpse of the last years of the Edwardian era, known by many as a period of relaxed morals, especially after the culture of civility and respectability that marked the 64-year reign of Queen Victoria that ended with her death in 1901, and whose values are best represented by Maggie Smith's character, the Dowager Countess. Known as the jovial uncle, King Edward VII, or Bertie, was a renowned womanizer and aging party boy. His reign did usher in a time of experimentation in the arts, with modernist literature, music, and dance. For example, the experimental nude dancing of American Isadora Duncan took Europe by storm. But this simplified view of the Edwardians ignores the fact that the decade before World War I was also a time of economic and political turmoil, marked by worker strikes, militant suffragettes demanding the vote and staging hunger strikes. And of course, we know that Lady Sybil goes to a suffrage rally, but her older sisters, of course, don't really have much interest in the vote. And that was quite typical. Aristocratic women tended to be conservative and liked the status quo. Also of concern in the Edwardian period was the Irish question. Parliament had to battle the Irish demand for home rule, perhaps even independence. And also there was the growing rivalry with Germany. In season 1 of Downton, this larger political context fades into the background because, quite simply, it's the smaller, everyday changes and problems that intrude and disrupt the lives of the residents, and which make this remote world seem so relatable to viewers. One of these changes involves technology. In almost every episode, we are reminded of the many technological advances that confronted people living in the early 20th century. The Titanic proved that a ship, a feat of modern engineering, was indeed sinkable. Technology, the driving force of modernity, was to be both embraced and feared. The wealthy are now carted around in chauffeur-driven motor cars rather than horse-drawn carriages. Most respectable ladies before the war don't yet drive their own cars, but the automobile becomes quite literally a vehicle of sexual liberation and class transgression, as we watch Lady Sybil develop a relationship with the handsome Irish chauffeur Branson, who encourages her radical political views in the process of falling in love with her. And then in the 1920s, couples will use the automobile with its roomy back seat for necking and petting as part of this new sexual revolution. Sadly, the automobile will also be the death of Matthew Crawley at the end of season 3, a quite common occurrence in the 20s, since there were few regulations on speed and almost no traffic lights. Other examples, thankfully less lethal, involve the downstairs staff, coping with telephones and electric mixers. Though comical, there is real cause for concern. Daisy may enjoy her new machine, but if such modern tools make jobs easier to do, will they also make the numerous staff running the household redundant, as head cook Mrs. Patmore fears? Even the wealthy aren't at ease with technology. The Dowager Countess, using the telephone and getting frustrated with the inevitably bad connection, asks, is this an instrument of communication or torture? When Lord Grantham has wanted music in the Abbey, he hires live performers. But now his daughter has her own phonograph. And by season 5, Cousin Rose has even convinced her resistant uncle to buy a radio, which will prove vital in the coming years to rally the nation during the Depression and the Second World War. It will be the first time that the masses hear the voice of their king as he addresses the nation. In an even more interesting example, we see how technology helps a member of the downstairs staff aspire to a life outside of domestic service. In the 3rd episode of season 1, the maid Gwen has purchased a typewriter and intends to leave service to become a secretary, a goal encouraged and aided by Lady Sybil, who professes both feminist and socialist beliefs. The generally positive reaction of the aristocrats upstairs and the ease with which Gwen obtains her position as a secretary reveal our modern belief that everyone can and should live their dream. Of course, such social mobility was not usually so easy to achieve. Gwen would have faced harsher criticism, most of which would have focused on her gender, and her success would have been less likely. And indeed, she faces her toughest obstacles among her peers, who look at the machine with horror and envy. Clearly, she must think that she is better than they are. In fact, most typewriters, and the woman who typed was called a typewriter, and what we would call secretaries, tended to come from middle-class urban families. But Gwen's story does reflect how clerical work gets feminized by the early 20th century. Employers liked the way women's delicate hands managed the machine's keys, and they could pay them half of a man's wage for the same job. Gwen's dream of social mobility is achieved through study and hard work, and her connection to the Crawleys. Since there are no sons upstairs, none of the female staff can harbor the fantasy of marrying one of their betters. Such a fantasy is the stuff of novels and only leads to misery, as we see in the case of Ethel, whose affair with Major Charles Bryant, recovering from his wartime injuries at Downton, results in the loss of employment, unwed pregnancy, prostitution, and finally handing over her parental rights to her son's wealthy grandparents, who will only allow Ethel to love the child from afar. Poor Ethel, she really gets a raw deal. Even less likely to be a success, or we think in the beginning, is the marriage of Lady Sybil and Branson, the chauffeur. The family's grudging acceptance of not only a working class but Irish and Catholic husband for their youngest daughter may seem romantic to viewers, but in truth puts both Sybil and Tom in a limbo position, outsiders in both of their own social circles. Tom can never fit in at Downton. He fails miserably at small talk and all the social graces that are taken for granted by his in-laws. His Irish Republican views are an important reminder that while we may idealize English history as quaint and romantic, there were others, like the Irish, who wanted at the minimum home rule and at the most complete independence from the empire. And the couple's happiness is destined to be brief. with Tom at one point on the run for his political activism. A pregnant Sybil is left on her own in poor health, and this will later have lethal consequences for her. The relationship between Matthew and Mary, also from different classes, is by comparison much easier for the family to accept. After all, Matthew is middle class, which is better than Tom's working class background. He's also university educated, very articulate, trained in the law, and the heir to the estate. So thus, he's socially far superior to Branson. He may feel uncomfortable being dressed by a valet, but he's articulate and a quick study, and soon fits in at the Abbey. It is his mother, Isabel Crawley, formerly a nurse, who constantly points out the silliness of the old way of doing things, so cherished by Lord Grantham and his mother, the Dowager Countess. But even Isabel enjoys many of the social functions to which she's now invited. And by season 5, she's even fallen in love with an aristocratic widower. But the first 2 seasons, Downton's drama is dominated by Matthew and Mary's will they or won't they fall in love and marry. Of course, Mary would like to marry for love, but what really matters here is that Mary must marry. This is, after all, her purpose in life. In a way, she has less freedom than the servants below stairs, and she knows this. She's beautiful, but most aristocratic women aren't married off for their beauty, but for their dowries. At one point, she says in exasperation, "My life makes me angry." Her life may seem enviable on the surface, but she knows she'll be a moral and social failure if she doesn't land a rich husband. She hasn't been educated at university, and she has no marketable skills. And her father abhors the new woman types who work for a living, as we see when Edith becomes a journalist. It's really middle-class young women who are the new women in the early 20th century, attending university or secretarial schools, riding their bicycles, rallying for the vote, and supporting themselves and living on their own in London. And if they marry, it's for love. Mary is rooted in the old world and not prepared for the new world. Alas, Mary's romantic problems must be put on hold as the Great War begins in 1914 and transforms life at the Abbey for those upstairs and down in season 2. While middle and upper class men like Matthew would fill the officer ranks and have their own servants in the trenches, the rest, like Thomas and William, would fill the rank and file. Many men eagerly rushed to recruiting offices in 1914, but eventually the high death toll on the Western Front prompted the government by 1916 to institute conscription, the draft. Not every man was willing or able to serve, and those who did became quickly disillusioned the longer they spent in the trenches. The average lifespan in the trench was about 3 to 6 months. Some were shamed into service, as we see faithfully recreated in the episode when ladies at a hospital benefit hand out white feathers to the male servants who have just waited on them, with viewers' least favorite sister, Lady Edith, saying, "It's hard to watch healthy young men do nothing." No one but Branson objects to the war on moral grounds. After all, why should Ireland fight England's war? And there are no conscientious objectors who disgrace Downton Hall. In fact, conchies, as they were called, were jailed in wartime. Thomas the footman gives himself a cushy, shooting his own hand in order to be sent home. A not uncommon occurrence, and certainly an understandable one. The model trenches on display in London made the public believe that their men were safe, comfortable, and well-fed, while newspaper censors admitted the reality of the mud, lice, rats, and rotting corpses that shared space with live soldiers on the front. Here's a day's catch in the trenches. Sorry for that one. Here. We'll go to this instead. Downton Abbey gives us a fairly sanitized version of the Western Front, but just enough for viewers to understand that the war, contrary to the propaganda at the time, was not a great adventure, a phrase used by many young men when they first enlisted, and it was taken from their beloved story, Peter Pan. The action on the front is shown largely through the heir's experiences. Matthew is shown in charge of his regiment who admire and like him, and he tosses off stiff upper lip quips like, "I've had bloody enough of this for one day," as he dodges sniper fire and explosions. In another episode, he leads a charge over the top, armed with just his bayonet. And, of course, the costume dramas love to recreate the 1916 Battle of the Somme, which he participates in. 60,000 men died in one day. They were instructed to walk, carrying only their bayonet, towards the German line, and they were all gunned down by sniper fire. So We do see how in this season he is injured and almost left for dead. But when he returns to Downton, it is in a wheelchair. And he has spinal damage, fearing that he will be left impotent, which was in fact a common injury for many men. But rather than letting the series enter Lady Chatterley terrain, Fellows has Matthew nobly release his fiancée Lavinia from her commitment because he thinks he can't give her children. Of course, we know he later recovers and marries Mary, only to die in a car accident in season 3, immediately after the birth of his much longed-for son. But his quick recovery at the time from his war injury is indeed miraculous, and probably one of the least believable moments of season 2. Soldiers on the front, lucky enough to survive, were left, there he is in his wheelchair, were left with shocking mementos of the war, thanks to the new inventions of mustard gas and machine guns. Loss of at least one limb, damaged lungs, partial loss of their faces, which they tried to conceal with masks when they went out in public, and while not visible, the psychological toll of the war. Shell shock was often the most debilitating and the most difficult for veterans' loved ones to handle. The war did lead to many advances in medicine, from plastic surgery to prosthetics and psychiatry. But hospitals at the time were overwhelmed with the wounded, and universities and private estates were converted into convalescent homes. In fact, the real Highclere Castle was converted to hospital use, with 30 nurses recruited and the family's personal physician hired as the medical director, and one of the main bedrooms used as an operating theater, just as Downton Abbey is converted into a convalescent hospital for officers. And even among the wounded, the class hierarchy needed to be maintained, as we see in the debate over whether one of their own servants, the dying William Mason, should be allowed to be nursed among his superior officers. So while not a complex depiction of the war, Downton does raise some timely issues for a nation and that of its masterpiece viewers across the pond, continuously at war somewhere in the world. For example, Isabel Crawley wonders, are we doing enough for veterans when it comes to rehabilitation? And even Lord Grantham, so disappointed that he was too old to fight, muses to a servant, do you ever wonder what it was all for? After the war, Britain's government tried to answer this question, or at least help the public cope with so much loss of life. While young people wanted to forget and party on, the dead and survivors needed to be commemorated. The Great War produced more monuments in Britain than any event in history. On Armistice Day, November 11, 1920, the tomb of the unknown warrior was unveiled in Westminster Abbey, with millions visiting in the first year. The inscription read, "A British warrior who fell in the Great War, 1914-1918, for king and country. Greater love hath no man than this." Every village, town, and city raised its own memorial. And during the 20s, Remembrance Day ceremonies with the communal laying of wreaths and the observation of a 2-minute silence occurred all over the country. The war is never forgotten at Downton either. And 3 seasons later, in 2014, during the first year of the Great War's centenary, the war once again takes center stage. The Earl and his butler Carson butt heads over location and other details of their town's war memorial. But at the end of the season, all petty squabbles are resolved as the household joins the rest of the town in the village square. Bugles play, and the memorial is unveiled as the camera pans the somber crowd. The TV series itself has become a small-screen memorial in which we can all partake. And I do mean all. Lord Grantham has even arranged a special plaque to commemorate the death of his cook's nephew, shot for treason, but whose only crime was going AWOL due to shell shock. Lord Grantham has suddenly become very much ahead of his time, because it wasn't until the year 2000 that the Shot at Dawn Memorial was dedicated to the British and colonial soldiers shot for cowardice and desertion during the war. Nevertheless, the plaque is some distance from the memorial honoring the true heroes of the town. It's just as it should be, another servant comments, reaffirming the good judgment of the lord of the estate. For even though politicians like Winston Churchill claimed that World War I was a great leveler of the social classes, there still needed to remain a hierarchy of the dead. So much of Downton's world is changed by the war, especially for the lives of the women upstairs. While her husband feels useless in his old uniform, Lady Cora ably manages the hospital in her home, and her daughters all take on war work. Young ladies like Sybil combine their desire for independence and need to have something to do. Joan Pointer, an actual aristocratic daughter turned wartime nurse, recalled, I had passion for independence, and I knew that I wasn't going to get much in the pre-war days except through marriage. But luckily, I got it immediately by pretending I was much older and going in for nursing. Meanwhile, Edith, who lacks the warmth of Sybil, becomes a land girl, one of thousands of single women who ran the farms to feed the nation while the men were at the front. She learns to drive a tractor and even has a brief flirtation with a married farmer. Overall, the war was liberating for women, although working-class women who did munitions work while earning more than in their former factory jobs often suffered serious injuries, sometimes death. And here we have the example of the Canary Girls, who were called this because their skin was burned or stained yellow from exposure to TNT. After the war, women age 28 received the right to vote, and not surprisingly, most women who were working, whether it was in factories or in civil service, were largely pushed out of the workforce, even though many would be widowed or with no marriage prospects whatsoever, since almost a generation of men never returned from the front. Many women realized they would likely never marry, since the war left a gender imbalance, and this especially concerns Lady Edith, who from the start of the series has been in peril of spinsterhood. As the middle child, and always reminded she's not the prettiest of the three daughters, Edith's parents have never had much hope for her future, as illustrated by this conversation. Robert says, "Poor old Edith, we never seem to talk about her." Cora says, "I'm afraid Edith will be the one taking care of us in our old age." And Robert says, "Oh, what a ghastly prospect." Edith herself seems to think the best she can hope for is the middle-aged Sir Anthony Strallan, but even he cruelly leaves her at the altar. But Edith has a rebellious side, which we witness when she volunteers as a land girl, and after the war, she undergoes a transformation in her wardrobe and her attitude. She jaunts to London to embark on a journalistic career. Her newfound confidence attracts the attentions of the still married newsman, Michael Gregson, with some serious consequences. Edith's transformation reflects the larger social and sexual changes of the new post-war jazz age. The 1920s witnessed the first sexual revolution. Modern women, or flappers as they were commonly called, bobbed their hair, wore makeup, and shed the corsets and wardrobes of their mothers for a liberated, boyish style. Even Mary finally goes for the Lulu-esque bob and shocks her family. Long hair was the essence of Victorian womanhood, and cutting it off in the 20s was definitely an important statement for women to make. Flappers exercised, drove cars, smoked and drank, and experimented sexually before marriage. They embraced the spirit of the post-war age, and why not? After so much pointless loss of life, young people wanted fun. The bright young things in London made the headlines with their treasure hunts and drunken, sometimes nudist-themed parties. Freudian psychology suddenly was all the rage, as sexual repression was frowned upon, and doctors even performed hymenotomies on brides who wanted to enjoy their wedding night. Unfortunately, though, for many women, this new age of fun still came with a price. Mary says to her father, "I know everything, I've been married." But her sister Edith needs some guidance. The best-selling book by Marie Stopes, Married Love, offered couples practical advice on everything from contraception to orgasm, and married women could attain a diaphragm or cervical cap from their doctors. But none of this was available to single women. Even Mary, now widowed in season 5, must covertly procure one of these internal devices for her weekend getaway with Lord Gillingham and ask her maid Anna to hide it for her. Modern viewers are reminded by this story arc to not take for granted their own reproductive rights, which in the States, as we all know, are currently under threat. And then a great advertisement and tie-in for the UCLA Library Special Collections, using Downton Abbey to advertise their Marie Stopes collection. Edith's one night with Michael clearly does not involve any precautions. As a single woman, a pregnancy out of wedlock, even during this new liberated age of the 20s, would result in great shame for Edith, one way in which she is no different from the servant Ethel. And like Ethel, she will have to give up her child to ensure its future, or risk death in an illegal abortion. Edith can't and won't shame her family, but unlike Ethel, she has the resources to hide her secret with a long holiday in Switzerland, and then find a good home for the baby and resume her life as a single woman. Not only would there be great shame for the unwed mother, but also for the child, who by law would be illegitimate, a bastard, with no rights of inheritance and a social stigma attached to his or her name. We would like a happy ending for Edith, love and motherhood, But even if Michael returns, it's 1923. The couple may marry, but they'll have to wait until the law changes in 1926, when the Legitimacy Reform Act finally allows a child to be legitimate if the parents marry after the fact of his or her birth. Of course, by the last season, we know Michael will never return, and Fellows finally stops punishing Edith as though she were a Victorian fallen woman. Her parents, finally aware of her secret, will allow her to raise the child, Marigold, as her ward, a tiny compromise that saves the family honor and also allows Edith some semblance of motherhood. Edith, at least, may be able to watch her daughter grow up, even if she doesn't claim her full parental rights. Her youngest sister, Sybil, sadly, will never raise her own daughter. Sybil's death in childbirth was, for viewers, perhaps one of the saddest, but also most realistic moments in the series. Even by the 1920s, the maternal mortality rate was still high at 5 fatalities per 1,000 births, and it was the only major cause of death to show an increase in the interwar period. As a result, despite the medical advances of the 19th century, which lowered mortality rates generally, thousands of women still died in childbirth every year. As the Dowager Countess reminds us, our darling Sybil has died in childbirth, like too many women before her. Downton Abbey hasn't been afraid to tackle what would have been taboo topics even in the 20s, such as prostitution and unwed pregnancy, as well as interracial love, as in the case of Rose and the jazz singer Jack Ross. His character was based on Leslie Hutch Hutchinson, a black cabaret performer who had multiple affairs with British aristocratic women, all the while being admitted through the servants' entrance when paid to perform in their homes. Added to this list of risque subjects is Downton's treatment of homosexuality in the character of the footman Thomas, whose scheming ways but good looks make him a character fans love to hate. Or hate to love, I'm not sure. The 1970s series, Upstairs, Downstairs, also had a homosexual footman, whose fate was much more tragic than that of Thomas. Alfred ran off with a wealthy house guest and was later hanged for murdering another rich lover. Even dealing with this issue in a 1970s serial drama was quite bold. While homosexuality had been decriminalized in Britain in 1967, it was still considered a medical pathology, and this is evident in the presentation of Alfred's self-loathing and religious fanaticism and his eventual descent into criminal insanity. In Downton Abbey, Thomas's homosexuality is pretty much of an open secret from the start. In season 1, Mrs. Patmore tries to tell Daisy that her crush on Thomas is pointless. "He's not a ladies' man," she shouts at her. And that becomes impossible to ignore in season 3, when his advances towards another servant, Jimmy, are witnessed by a third servant, Alfred, who wants to report it to the police. The downstairs staff don't quite know how to react to this revelation. The housekeeper, Mrs. Hughes, remarks, "I think the point is that we didn't know officially. That's what Mr. Carson finds hard. He can't avoid the subject any longer because it's lying there on the mat." It's finally up to Lord Grantham, who needs Thomas's cricket skills for a big game to persuade the police that the charge was a mistake. And he also has to persuade Alfred to drop the charge, asking his servant to introduce a little kindness into the question. He continues, "Thomas doesn't choose to be the way he is, and what harm was done really that his life should be destroyed for it?" The very nonchalant attitude of season 3 toward homosexuality seems shockingly inaccurate for some, for a period in which homosexuality was regarded as both a sin and a crime that carried severe consequences, 2 years imprisonment with hard labor. Perhaps Downton is guilty here of whitewashing history, depicting the treatment of homosexuals in a way that supports our current sentiments. Some critics fear that this approach has dangerous consequences. In order to avoid perpetuating and condoning the sexism and homophobia of the past, modern TV alters these negative views, yet in the same stroke, this alteration misrepresents the historical oppression faced by minority groups. But I think sometimes this is why we like modern costume dramas, because they present the past as we would have liked it to be at times. Thomas, though scheming and often cruel in his treatment of others, reminds us that he is oppressed. He cannot openly discuss his feelings for another servant, the way that Daisy constantly moons over Alfred. In an earlier episode, he comments to another servant, "All my life they've pushed me around, just because I'm different." Of course, he could take a job in London, which in the 1920s had a thriving gay subculture and greater opportunities for anonymity. But whether in London or at the Abbey, if he ever does fall in love and has those feelings reciprocated, it will have to stay concealed, since homosexuality will remain a crime for 4 more decades. He is, to use the popular euphemism of his day, an unspeakable. The other taboo topic which Downton has tackled, with very controversial results, is rape. The costume drama, as a genre, has always primarily been directed at women, and just as it provides romance and escapism, it also often addresses what we'd call serious women's issues, as we see in season 4 with the rape of Anna by a visiting servant. Julie Anne Taddeo was widely criticized in the media for doing this to the fan favorite, and many thought it was a cheap rating stunt. You see the headlines from the newspaper that Downton had gone too far. The Washington Post wrote the morning after the rape episode, "In its final minutes, the show descended into a wholly undoubted darkness, from which I'm not sure it can fully recover, and likely will lose some of its more than 10 million fans who tuned in to watch last week. Nothing prepares you for his violent attack and rape of Anna, Downton's most likable and kindest character. It is an act so out of step in sensibility with what Downton Abbey has become that it feels almost like the worst sort of gimmick, an attempt to shock an audience that was just out for a nice walk in the park. Simply put, the rape of Anna seems too disturbing a turn for a show that is at its core a celebration of fluff, frivolity, and fabulous fashion." Some alliteration. Actually, Fellows gets a lot right here, and I give him credit for making the series about more than fluff and fabulous fashion. The English common law of coverture stated that a wife was under the wing, protection, and cover of her husband, with no legal identity of her own. By the early 20th century, a married woman could finally keep her own inheritance or her earnings from employment. She could sue and be sued and sign contracts, but there were other ways in which she was still treated like her husband's property. For example, marital rape wasn't even recognized by law until 1991 in Britain. So when Anna is violated by another man, it isn't surprising that she tells her husband, "I feel spoiled for you," or that it's Mr. Bates and not Anna who feels the need to be avenged. And in rape cases, it was the victim who was usually blamed for inciting the man. Defense attorneys argued that rape was really a seduction. The legal terminology was that the victim consented to violence. And to even admit in a court of law that you had been raped cast doubt on the virtue of your character. So Anna's sense of shame and desire to keep secret what happened to her seems very true to the times. In households like Downton, and even in smaller ones in which fewer servants were employed, rape of female domestics by their wealthy employers, and just as often by their fellow male servants, was a reality of the times. There were no sexual harassment laws, and if a woman found herself pregnant as a result, she was fired without a reference and likely destined for poverty or prostitution. Of course, a more credible portrayal of the rape would have shown the perpetrator to be a member of the upstairs family, given that members of this class frequently viewed their domestic employees as theirs for the taking. But Julie Anne Taddeo has always been wary of portraying the family upstairs as in any way irresponsible or deviant. For instance, Lord Grantham resists an affair with a maid in an earlier episode. Nevertheless, Anna's rape touches on a timeless issue. Rape, as we all know, still occurs all too frequently, and despite better laws, attitudes don't always change, with the victim often blamed or feeling responsible. So now I'd just like to use the last few minutes just to ponder, why is this series so popular? There have been many attempts to figure out why Downton Abbey is so popular, and other recent costume dramas equally so. For instance, Mr. Selfridge, about the Edwardian department store in London, takes us into a fantasy world of fashion and endless consumerism. Beautiful gowns and tea sets, perfume bottles, and then there is the drama of the relationships between and among the classes who work side by side in the store. The latest sensation, the late 18th century set Poldark, features a brooding hunk and the beautiful Cornwall scenery. And the 1920s set, Miss Fisher's Murder Mysteries, gives us a feminist lady detective with a killer wardrobe. In 2015, the small screen costume drama is doing big business. I mean, not since the 1970s, which was really the golden age of the TV costume drama, have we seen this kind of interest. And the BBC, for instance, has just contracted until 2020 to have 5 seasons of Poldark. So great is the success, and people are loving it. In America, these programs perhaps convey a sense of cultural exoticism, as well as speaking to our own obsessions and desires. They draw us into another world. Yes, nostalgia is part of it. We often long for a past that we think was more attractive, where people generally acted more civilly towards each other. Fancy motor cars, presentations at court, even the excitement below stairs of preparing a lavish meal for a large party upstairs. All of this seems so alien to our world today, and therefore romantic. When we think about our present 21st century world, there is much to dislike. The technology is ugly or almost invisible. No beautiful phonograph to wind up and dance to, as Matthew and Mary did. We just download music from the internet. Life is hectic, our city's overcrowded, traffic, so maybe we long for a horse-drawn carriage. We won't get there any faster, though. We can escape into what TV sometimes presents as a simpler world, a rural estate whose problems seem remote and quaint, yet still familiar. And the truth is that Victorians and Edwardians, they all had the same complaints. Too much rapid change, pollution, crime, too much traffic. Gender roles were becoming topsy-turvy. As we continue to watch and immerse ourselves in this world of the past on TV, we begin to realize that the other world was not so simple after all. A rich woman like Sybil dies in childbirth just as easily as a poor one does. The Great War wipes out millions. A flu can take out even more. The Dowager Countess almost dies in one episode of bronchitis because there are no antibiotics. Servants must know their place, as must a black man, no matter how talented a singer he is, and an Irishman risks imprisonment for his political beliefs. Homosexuals must lead double lives, and illegitimate children, though innocent of any crime, are branded as bastards and their mothers as whores. Even rich women must know their place, to marry and breed an heir, and the wealthiest of men are duty-bound. All of their actions reflect on their family because the weight of the past and the future of the estate falls on the shoulders of men like Lord Grantham. A simpler time? No, simply a different time. So finally, what awaits our residents at Downton Abbey as the series enters its 6th and final season? Clearly, fans still want the romance. Who will Mary choose as husband number 2? Will Edith ever be able to claim her baby as her own? Will she ever fall in love again? Will Thomas be allowed a romance without the threat of prison or blackmail hanging over his head? And will Anna and Mr. Bates be able to heal, not just from her rape, but from yet another suspicion of murder? The historians in us know that other larger, scarier things are on the horizon for the family upstairs and their servants below. In a few years, the stock market will crash, and the country will be sunk into depression, which will hit even the wealthiest of families. Will this household that has already avoided financial collapse a couple of times be able to survive the Great Depression and maintain its lavish standard of living? Will more servants leave the isolated world of the Abbey, or will they be laid off and left destitute? On the continent, fascism is already on the rise in the 20s. Many British aristocrats in the 20s were initially attracted to Mussolini and Hitler, who were hailed as strong leaders who performed economic miracles. Will any of the Crawleys be drawn to this movement? But for the moment, let us enjoy the Roaring Twenties, which for some members of the family and downstairs staff, like Carson, are already too radical in values and modern conveniences. In one episode, the Dowager Countess, played so wonderfully by Dame Maggie Smith, says, "I hanker for a simpler world. Is that a crime?" In the same way the Dowager looks back to the past of her young Victorian days with fond remembrance, the viewers look back to Edwardian England to escape what ails us today. And if that past is sometimes cleaned up and made nicer than it really was, what is wrong with that? Is that a crime? Thank you. And just if you're interested in learning more about costume dramas, you can refer to my book. So, any questions? Yes, we're taking questions. We have a microphone.
There hasn't been mention at all of Monarch of the Glen, in which Julian Fellowes was an actor, and the main characters of that were those that had one of these lavish, beautiful castles, which were bankrupt, and their whole series was how to, make financial ends meet. Has there been some kind of talk of Julian using some of that program, that series, to elaborate it into Downton Abbey?
Well, first, a couple of things. He borrows very liberally from the 1970s Upstairs, Downstairs. If you watch that series or go back and watch it again, you'll see how he rips off certain plots. It's really amazing, but people have short memories. And it's funny that you mentioned Monarch of the Glen because I've just been watching it. I'm on season 3. And that series was made in the early 2000s. I think no one could get away with that series now in light of the issue of Scottish independence. Now, there's going to be another referendum, and I think people might be appalled by this presentation of the kindly laird who's handsome and loves everyone on the estate. And they sit down to eat with their servants, and he even marries his housekeeper. And Julian Fellowes doesn't write for the show, but he plays the silly aristocrat, right, the neighbor. But the story itself is based loosely on the Highland novels, right, of Compton Mackenzie. But I didn't discover that series until very recently. I don't really think that that series would have such a big audience if it were made in this current climate.
But I do see similarities between that and this one.
Oh, definitely. Though it's set in the early 21st century, the way that they all sit down to dine together and they take care of each other. And when other outsiders say, oh, why is your servant eating with you? The nice laird, this 30-something hunk, says, you know, they're one of the family. So, exactly. And that's the way we'd like to think of this class system. But it really doesn't work that way.
I was interested that although you mentioned race relations with Jack Ross and Rose, you didn't mention that she actually marries somebody who's Jewish, and this causes a kerfluffle.
It's true, and that's in my longer version, but there were several examples that I wanted to include, and I just left that out. Yeah, Rose is actually a very interesting character because she's young, so she gets to enjoy the jazz age. First, she has that affair with the married guy, right? They pull her out of the nightclub, so she's the wild one. And then finally, she gets presented at court, and everyone breathes a sigh of relief. But then, of course, she falls in love with a guy from a very wealthy family, and it turns out that they're Jewish. So yes, that was based on an actual family, and but there's not, when she sees him, she would never even think that he was Jewish because they use a very English-sounding name, and the wife and the son sort of put it in the background. I think it's the father who embraces his Jewish identity. But the family comes around because, yet again, money trumps everything. He has so much money that why would they not want this husband for her? And she's been such a naughty girl with a married lover and then the black singer that this is okay in the end.
I admit to continuing to watch Downton Abbey, but I think it's mostly because of the costumes and the production values. It's just beautiful. But I also think that the dialogue is sometimes preposterously anachronistic. People did not talk to each other that way in those times. What can you say about that, about norms of formality and reserve, and what's not said being as important as, or perhaps more important than what is said?
There are lots of things like that I try not to look for because it will bother me too much. And I think I mentioned this when I had my interview for the talk. There was an uproar because in one episode, I think they may have gone back and edited it out. When they panned to the bookcase, there was a copy of Gone with the Wind. And it's like, who did that? They just took any book they could find and stuck it on the bookcase. And Lady Cora is always saying golly, which was a new slang term at the time, but I doubt an aristocratic woman would be saying golly. Maybe the fact that she's American makes it okay. So it is true. I'm wondering if it's because viewers don't want that formal, stilted language. When I go back and I watch the old Upstairs, Downstairs, it feels so much truer to the way people would have talked and behaved. But the 1970s, they don't have that kind of budget. So you get that stagey feel, and everything is filmed indoors in a studio. So it's this balance. Do you want the lavish sets and the outdoor scenery? And are you willing to sacrifice some intellectual depth? And I think that's really what viewers are aiming for. And it's an ITV production. And for people who study, TV history, ITV has always had, it's sort of like a second player to the BBC. The BBC sees itself as producing more intellectual material. But now they've gone the other direction to compete with ITV, with Poldark. And the same thing is with Poldark. I'm appalled by the dialogue when I think of the original series and the novels they're based on. He doesn't say these kind of sentimental things like, you're the only love of my life. And men didn't really talk like that. I don't know if they do now. But I think they're pandering to their audiences. They want a younger audience. And that's something that they're very blatant about. They want to attract a hipper audience. And so I don't know if it's dumbing it down, but I know a lot of us probably don't like it.
I didn't catch Lady Cora saying golly, but I did catch have gun will travel. And I wondered how that got into there.
I don't know.
And also, I just want to make a comment, then ask a question. But I remember reading that Julian Fellows actually took the story of Downton Abbey, the male heir, suddenly called up from being a lawyer to being an estate person, on a real example that he knew of a friend of his that suddenly was the only male heir to an estate, and he knew nothing about. He was just a middle-class person. He had to learn how to run an estate. And I also that Julian Fellows knew someone who had a diary from an aunt who had worked as a servant in a great house where such a thing that happened with Lady Mary actually did occur.
Okay.
Yeah, and was totally covered up because a scandal in the house would also reflect on the servants, and no one wanted that. Okay, now I want to say I'm a product of the history department at the University of Maryland, right? Though everyone I had for history has now retired at least. Maybe not Dr. Breslow if he's still living. I don't even know, but
He is.
He is. I'm glad to hear that. Yes. I remember the question when I was at the University of Maryland was, why didn't England have a revolution like France? Yeah, that was a big question. And the answer we all came to was that the answer can be found in the novels of Jane Austen, especially Mr. Knightley, who is very concerned about the welfare of the people who work on his estate, and who really appreciates the work that they do and the sacrifices they make. So I just assumed that this was still the culture that was going on in Downton Abbey times, that things don't change that rapidly in countries, and that these people were somewhat concerned about the people in the village having employment and wanting to keep the abbey going so they could help as much as possible to avoid poverty in the village.
I'm sure there were some households where there was concern for servants, but to be a servant was really not an enviable job. When you reached a certain age and you couldn't do the heavy labor that was required of you, there was no compelling need on the part of the employers to keep them on. This household, it's a little strange because it's such an enormous household that there should actually be more servants. They would have a really large staff and probably not even know most of their names. They would just refer to them by the title of the job that they performed. And they would also have a separate staff for their townhouse in London. So obviously we can't have too many characters, so we have to keep the staff smaller here. And if it is a smaller household, because some aristocrats don't have these lavish estates, they can't afford them any longer. They will get to know these people, especially someone who's in the role of the nanny or the governess who's raising their children, and the head housekeeper. But the minor servants, the scullery maids, the hall boys, they're anonymous, they're insignificant, and they're easily replaced. So I think maybe there are some cases of intimacy and concern, but the larger the household, the less likely that is to be the case, I think.
With reference to World War I, have you seen the series The Crimson Field?
I've just started watching it, yes. I don't like it as much as I like Testament of Youth from the 1970s, which is based on Vera Britton's memoir, and which has just been remade into a movie for the big screen. I think that one just was a more beautiful series, and it focuses on the one important character. Crimson, I couldn't get attached to any of the characters yet, but I'm going to give it a second try.
Other questions? Well, join me again in thanking Professor Julie Taddeo, and I hope that you will all think about joining us for the rest of the series of the arts of the humanities and the other arts and humanities events that we'll be having this fall. Thank you.
Thank you.